Come on over here.
Okay, good.
Lectures always start the same way with weird introductions and some backstory about history. I'm just going to jump right into it. This is Miles. Where are you from, Miles?
Georgia.
Atlanta area, I think, memory serves. And your name is?
Edmund.
Okay. Miles, I want you to be any country other than the world. I want you to think about it when you're using prep then. All right? Other than Cuba. Okay? What'd you say your name was?
Andrew.
Andrew. Okay. Same question to you, and think of maybe two, because Miles is probably going to steal yours. This is Adam and Katie and Katie. Right? Okay. Katie, you're going to be Cuba. Okay? Come with me, Katie. Katie would very much like to get a Scooby snack. And as an aside, I would like to say that if you've not tried Scooby snacks, they are delicious. I don't want to hear any, they're not healthy for you, or that I'm too old to have Scooby snacks. I don't care. All right, they're fantastic. And it's very understandable that Katie, as the nation of Cuba, would like to receive a Scooby snack, but she can't have one. All right. Miles, what country are you? What's that? All right, Haiti. So why don't you stand in relative proximity to, as you understand the global map, Cuba. Okay, you're pretty close. What country would you like to be?
Iceland.
Iceland. Okay. All right, so you have to kind of go over there. All right. Miles, here's your Scooby snack. Iceland. Catch it on the fly. It was a bad pass. It was a bad pass. And we've knocked over the technology. Mistakes were made. Okay. All right. Adam, what country would you like to be?
Chile.
Chile? Okay. So you're pretty well situated, right? All right. Go ahead, and we'll make Katie the United States of America. All right. Come here, Katie. All right. Now, you have lots of Scooby snacks. Okay. Now, the goal of the United States of America is, for many, many years, 50 plus years, to try to prevent Katie from obtaining not just Scooby snacks, but all kinds of goods and products. All right? So, you kind of have other Katie over here that's just holding up, and it's like, you can't have this, Katie. All right? Nothing you can do. All right? There's nothing you can do. All right? We're not going to give it to you. All right? And if an American company, all right, tried, let's pretend for a moment that this Katie is not the United States of America, but was a United States company, try to take the Scooby snack over to the other Katie. See, I would get in the way. All right? And then try this one. And I would get in the way over here. Okay? All right? So the United States has a formal set of measures that it takes, which we'll talk about, that try to prevent Cuba from getting Scooby snacks. Now, Katie, let's just use logic here. All right? What would you do if you wanted to have a Scooby snack and you kind of were envious of other Katie's Scooby snacks? What would you do?
Try and get them.
From?
Another place.
Like?
Iceland.
Or?
Haiti.
Or?
Chile.
All right. And what would stop you from doing that?
The United States.
The United States would try, okay, but it's a lot easier for me as the United States police force to stop this Katie. It's harder for me to stop Chile. It's harder for me to stop Haiti. It's harder for me to stop Iceland, okay? All right, so we're going to kind of use that, and Katie, you can give the other Katie a Scooby snack now, all right, to kind of demonstrate the opening section of the discussion. Let's give them a round of applause for all the help that they've done. So they're good. And the blue Scoobies, you don't get one every pack, but they're really good. Okay. All right. My name is Will Repko. I coach debate at Michigan State University. I'm going to admit defeat at the start of this discussion. There's no way I can do justice to Cuba and all the history and all the policy that exists in Cuba in 70, 75 minutes. So instead, I'm going to break it up into a series of major points, and I'm going to answer your questions to the best of my ability. And bullet point number 1 in your notes should be the United States embargo on Cuba. Good morning. Who would like to define what an embargo is? Go ahead. What's your name?
Dan.
Dan, where are you from? Michigan, okay.
Stopping trade between two countries.
stopping of trade between two countries. I like that definition. Anyone else want to please? Go ahead.
A moratorium on trade.
A moratorium on trade. Okay, so let's talk about the dictionary definition of what an embargo is, and then transition into Cuban embargoes. An embargo, which is a word you'll hear a lot on this topic, is a partial or complete prohibition on trade with a particular country.
That's you.
Usually this takes the form of the next magic word that would be under Section 1, the embargo, and that's a trade sanction. A trade sanction is a penalty that one country imposes upon another country. I was the trade sanction in our little skit, as I prevented this Katie from selling her Scooby snacks to this Katie. The most famous embargo that the United States has is the United States embargo on Cuba. Trade sanctions can exist in two ways. Unilateral, UNI, like a unicycle, and multilateral. Who would like to explain the basic difference? I think you'll get this pretty fast. Don't be afraid. Go ahead. What's your name?
Harrison.
Harrison.
Unilateral is between two countries and multilateral is between multiple countries.
Yeah, so a unilateral trade regime, Harrison's answer is one where it's between the United States and one country. In this case, Cuba. A multilateral regime is where the United States is successful at getting many other countries to agree. So my efforts in this skit would have been much more successful if I could have convinced Haiti and Chile and Iceland, thank you, to agree that they wouldn't give Scooby snacks to Cuba. The United States has a fairly successful multilateral trade sanction regime in some parts of the world. For instance, most of the countries in the world have signed on to not trade with North Korea. And many of the countries in the world have signed on to reduce their trade to Iran. There are 193 nations that are member countries of the United Nations. 193 countries with Scooby snacks. How many of the 193 countries agree with the United States' sanction regime towards Cuba? Go ahead.
Only Israel.
Only Israel. I slightly disagree, but it's close. Yeah.
It's three. Israel, the United States, and one country that's actually.
Israel, the United States, and he says one country that starts with a P, which is Palau. Okay? All right? We also, the United States was, in fairness to the situation, successfully able to get two other countries in the United States, United Nations, to abstain from voting, which means they didn't agree with the United States, but they didn't strongly disagree with the United States, so they just didn't vote. Maybe they didn't show up, I'm not sure. One of which is the Marshall Islands. The other one of which I need to look up again, because I don't even remember. Oh, the Federated States of Micronesia. I apologize for forgetting. All right? So you're not talking big trading countries that agree with the United States, which means in the real world, Cuba can trade with 188 other countries.
How many?
188. 187, because they're one of the 188. But that they would struggle to get support from the United States, Israel, Palau, and maybe, depending on how they're feeling, the Marshall Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia. But if they wanted to trade with Europe, if they wanted to trade with Canada, that is okay-ish. Now, who thinks that that means that the United States' embargo is ineffective? Go ahead in the purple. Explain why. Loud.
If they trade with other countries, it kind of defeats the purpose of cutting them off economically.
Okay, Katie can still get the Scooby snacks. All right, Miles, go ahead.
After 50 years, it hasn't really gotten us far.
Okay.
The negative engagement with everything going on.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good answer. Go ahead.
It's the same with the embargo of 1807 that the United States tried. The only people that it hurts is the U.S. Cuba
Okay,
is still
so there's an argument that it only hurts the U.S. because we can't trade with other countries. Go ahead, Michael.
It allows the leader of Cuba or Haiti to blame all of their problems on the U.S.
Ooh, that's kind of a neat one. All right, and let's run with that for a little bit. Some people think that the embargo on Cuba is ineffective because, and this is an important point to put under your first section of notes, because Cuba, in reality, has some problems that would cause people to be mad at their leaders, but the leaders in Cuba can always blame the United States for their problems. The truth of the matter is that this Katie could always get Scooby snacks, but if people were unhappy, she could blame the lack of Scooby snacks or the lack of anything on the United States and their big bad embargo. That frames a different point, which is that the embargo has a very large symbolic value. The United States is a huge country with a lot of trade. Cuba is the 75th most heavily populated country in the world. The United States appears in many circles to be singling out Cuba, refusing to trade with them. There's a huge anti-American sentiment which exists in certain parts of the world and certainly in parts of Latin America. And a lot of people think that it's mean that the United States is refusing to trade with Cuba. And it allows Cuban leaders, arguably, according to Michael, it allows Cuban leaders to scapegoat and say that their problems are really the fault of the embargo. Miles?
With the embargo, since you just said that lots of countries think it's mean,
Yeah.
could the embargo also make us more enemies or have other Latin American countries?
Okay,
not
so
like
for those of you that couldn't hear Miles' question, I'll repeat it. Miles said, does the embargo make us more enemies? And let's put this in our notes as well. The embargo is overwhelmingly unpopular in the rest of the world. Every year, for the last 21 years, the United Nations has voted on whether or not they support the United States embargo. The best the United States has ever done in that vote is lose on a 188-5 decision. Okay? Meaning that we don't get Chile or Iceland or Haiti to vote in support of the United States policy. Some years we've lost on a 191-2 decision. It varies. Marshall Islands, Micronesia, they're making up their minds, but it's not popular. And so people get angry about that. These are great points. Now let's go back to my original question. Who would like to take the other side of this equation and argue that when the United States doesn't trade with Cuba, that it does make a big difference, that it is meaningful? What's your name?
Grace.
Hi, Grace. Go ahead.
Well, the United States has a lot of businesses and it's quite a large country. It's the only superpower in the world. We have lots of technologies and stuff that Cuba could not get from other countries possibly. And just the fact that we aren't supporting them just gives people even a reason to still believe that the Castro brothers are not good people
Okay.
and are being mean to their people.
Okay, so she's hit the nail on the head, and for those of you that couldn't hear, we'll repeat our arguments in a moment. I want to get your opinion. Go ahead.
In terms of like sticking it to them, like there's a lack of medical supplies in Cuba, and that in turn has led to a lot of like pandemics, like blindness and infant mortality rates. So like, if you think like statistically like that, because that's.
Okay, Maybe it depends how you define success. So, when I was in Georgetown and I was at the Washington, D.C. last week, we were fortunate enough to meet with the person in the government who is in charge of enforcing the sanctions that the United States places upon Cuba. Very fortunate to have a sit down and talk with him. And he explained the following argument that I want all of you to understand. The affirmative argument is very strong, that Cuba can get trade from a lot of other countries. But it's not the case that the U.S. embargo is meaningless. Cuban citizens overwhelmingly would like access to U.S. products because U.S. products are very popular on the world stage. You know how people think that iPads are cool? Okay? It's harder to get an iPad because of the U.S.-Cuban embargo. And more meaningfully, it's a two-way street. We've only talked about how this Katie can't get a Scooby snack from the United States. But you know what this Katie really wants to do? She wants to trade her products with the United States because the United States is the largest market in the world. There are more consumers buying more things in the United States than anywhere. So the embargo on Cuba doesn't just prevent Scooby snacks from going to Cuba. It also prevents Cuba from trading its goods and services to the United States. And that could really help the Cuban people. So if you're on the affirmative, you want to say the Cuban embargo is totally ineffective. They can trade with 188 other countries to get the same thing. But if you're negative, you want to flip-flop this and say, not all of the other countries have the power that the United States has in terms of consumption and unique products. And that consumption and unique products would really make a difference to Cuba. And so you could use that as an argument as to why the United States federal government should hold out and should continue the embargo. And that's what debate is. It's the back and forth on those two kinds of questions. So, what does the United States do in the real world to try to prevent Katie from getting Scooby snacks from Chile and from Iceland? Does anyone know what they do? Do they just kind of let it happen? Go ahead. What's your name? Kate. There's lots of, yeah, it's a very popular name. All right, go ahead.
Other countries and threaten to take things away from them and possibly stop trading with them in some cases.
All right, so Kate says that they threaten other countries. Go ahead.
We establish penalties, and like if we know that they trade with Cuba, they're not allowed to trade with us.
We establish penalties. Okay, in the back. What's your name?
Neil,
Hey, Neil.
we could enforce a military blockade.
We could enforce a military blockade. We haven't done that for a long time with Cuba, okay? And that would be seen as pretty extreme. But yes, I suppose we could surround Katie with our army, all right, or our navy, all right, and make sure that she didn't get a Scooby snack. That would be very unpopular in the international community for reasons that I don't think I need to explain. But we could do that. And at one point we did have a blockade in Cuba. We'll talk about that later. Yeah.
Is the Cuban military that weak that they couldn't find one weak spot in the blockade to trade goods through?
Okay, I don't want to go down the path of the blockade because I don't think it's realistic that we're going to circle. I don't think the Obama administration is going to circle Cuba anytime soon, okay? All right, but one of the weaknesses in the embargo is that even when you try to enforce it or get other countries to enforce it, there are weaknesses that exist in it. That's, called smuggling, okay? And there's a lot of illegal trade which exists. I guess it would depend on how strong your blockade is, right? So, okay. I'd like to talk about two pieces of legislation and then give away the answer to my own question. The first piece of legislation is called the Cuban Democracy Act of 1999. The Cuban Democracy Act of 1999. For roughly 30 years, the United States didn't trade with Cuba, but it was just something that the presidents decided to do. The United States presidents. It wasn't anything that was law. In 1993, the United States says, we're going to make this law. And so the Congress passed the Cuban Democracy Act of 1993, which formally created the embargo as part of law. It's still going, it's still in effect, and if the United States were, in a magical act of debate, to end the embargo, which will be a popular argument that is advanced this season, they would need to use the Congress, in most instances, to end the embargo. In 1993, it took about 3 years for Congress to figure this out. So in 1996, they changed the law. They realized that Katie could still get Scooby snacks, and they passed a new piece of legislation that was called the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996.
Say that again.
I will. The Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996. It is referred to as the Libertad Act as well. That is accurate. Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996.
So did this happen before the Cuban Democracy Act?
Cuban Democracy Act 1993. If I misspoke, I apologize. Then a second act in 1996, which I will explain now. The first act passed what's called primary sanctions. Primary sanctions, which means that the United States and its companies are not allowed to trade with Cuba and vice versa. It took 3 years, but then Congress realized in the 1996 Act they needed to pass something, and this is the magical term I want you to learn, called secondary sanctions. Secondary sanctions. Now, I'm not running the blockade to prevent the United States from trading with Cuba. I'm putting a little pressure on Haiti. I'm putting a little pressure on Iceland. I'm putting a little bit of pressure on Chile. Secondary sanctions allow the United States to fine or refuse to trade with businesses from other countries that do not support the U.S. embargo. Go ahead.
How can they make this in a law with other countries? Why do countries have to follow this second law? Why
The countries don't have to follow the second law.
So why does Finland, let's say, have to accept that fine?
Did you say Finland?
Finland, Iceland, and all that.
Well, obviously they could choose not to accept the fine, or they could choose to take the penalty of not trading with the United States. But what does the United States have?
More Scooby snacks.
I don't know.
Not just all the Scooby snacks, but more consumers than any other country in the world. Americans buy all kinds of stuff. Watch like the QVC channel for one night. Americans are buying the dumbest things in the world, some of which are from Finland. Okay? All right? So, Finland needs to decide, is Cuba worth it? Okay? And the United States wants to put that pressure on Iceland, on Chile. All right? So, you're right. Finland could be like, forget you, I'm upset with this. Okay? But they do so at a cost. All right? So the United States' leverage in this situation is to put pressure by using our market power. Americans consume all kinds of stuff. Countries want access to the U.S. market. Go ahead, Michael.
You keep saying that it took 3 years for the Libertad Act to pass, except that it was 3 years before the Democracy Act for Libertad to pass. So, like, did they pass the one? Oh.
Primary sanctions 1993, secondary sanctions 1996. If I misspoke, I apologize.
You said we have leverage to use our market power.
Yes, ma'am.
Like, could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So the United States has a ton of consumers. When I say market power, I mean like the free market in the United States. You and your family could choose to purchase whatever you want. You could purchase goods from American companies, or you could produce goods from Iceland or Haiti or Chile. Does that make sense? If Chile is not in on that game, because the United States is penalizing them, then Chile's going to lose a lot of business. Does that make sense? So that's what I mean by that. Does that help? Kate, go ahead. I know you've been meaning to ask.
How has that really been successful with the SOP supporters? Are they just going with the penalty because it is such a
Okay, so that's a great question by Kate. How has this not been so successful? And I actually asked the guy that I met in Washington, D.C., and he was pretty candid, okay? He was pretty candid. He said the United States Department of Treasury, and that is the part of the government that's in charge of enforcing this, pretty much doesn't go after people for small stuff. And so it's kind of known that as long as you're not egregiously violating the secondary sanctions, you're not going to get in that much trouble. So the truth of the matter is Finland probably doesn't have anything that would anger the United States enough for the United States to go crazy. Okay? But it's still overwhelmingly unpopular in the international community. Even if I don't crack down on Iceland, why is it still overwhelmingly unpopular in the international community? Go ahead.
They probably want to trade a lot more and think it's unfair that we're
They want to trade, but who cares? I mean, we don't really crack down on their trade that much. Go ahead.
Because we gave ourselves the power to be able to.
Yeah, people don't like the attitude. All right, you know what I mean? It's like, even if it's kind of like when the principal's like, I reserve the right to expel you for all these silly reasons, and they don't do it, it still kind of ruffles your feathers. You know what I mean? All right? And so people, they kind of don't like our primary sanctions, the 1993 thing, but they hate the 1996 thing, okay? Because we're all up in their grill, okay? Like before, it's like, okay, we wish that you would be nice to Cuba. But now, we're being mean to them, or potentially mean to them. So that's a big deal, all right? People don't like that. And honestly, we probably don't enforce our secondary sanctions that much because it would anger countries to an extremely large degree. So, can I steal you for a second, Vera? Stand up. Vera, can you tell the group where you're going later on? Is it this fall?
It's December.
This December? Where are you going, Vera?
Going to Cuba.
She's going to Cuba, all right? How? How is she allowed to go to Cuba if there's an embargo that is not allowed to have any trade? Go ahead, Kate.
There are two ways. One, you could get like special permission from the United States, or you could go to another country and then take that.
Ooh, let's talk about that, Miles. Is that you say the same thing?
Yeah, I was gonna say you could just like go to Haiti or Dominican Republic and then go from there.
All right, Vera, how are you going? Why don't you share it with the group?
I'm going directly there, but it's an educational situation, so there are restrictions on how you can come, the reasons why you come.
All right, so let's start, and that's all I need from you. Thank you very much. So, how cool is that she's going to go to one of the topic countries, okay? But if you all were like, let's take a family vacation to Cuba, that's not easy, okay? That's not a walk in the park. So, here are the exceptions that exist between the United States' embargo with Cuba. The United States almost allows zero trade from Cuba to the United States. Or, better put, the United States has huge import restrictions from Cuba. It is almost exception-free. But the United States has 4 prominent exceptions where we allow U.S. goods to go to Cuba. The first relates to food and agriculture. If you are a U.S. farmer, or more likely a U.S. agricultural business, and you would like to trade with Cuba, you can pretty much do so if you check it out with the United States. Secondly, is medicine. The United States increasingly allows medicine to go between the United States and Cuba. Go ahead.
Does Cuba allow U.S. GMO crops?
I'm not. Well, I mean, you gotta have a taker in Cuba, okay? So I think in theory, the United States would say, absolutely yes, we would sell GMO crops. but I think that Cuba would be much more interested in the conversation I have with people in Washington, D.C. in finalized food products than they would be interested in that kind of agricultural technology. Does that make sense? So they want the done tomato, or better put, the crops that come from the United States that are harder to grow in Cuba. As I understand it, there's not a lot of farming equipment, and I'm supposing from that agricultural technology that's being shipped to Cuba, and it's more the farmer that wants to sell Michigan cherries to the Cuban market, if that makes sense. Go ahead.
When you say medicine, does that include like medical technology too?
Well, I think that that's a dicey area, and if you were trading in medical technology, I would recommend you not just go and do it, but you bounce it off the United States federal government and apply for what's called a licensing exception, all right? But I think that you would be granted a license in most instances. Go ahead, Miles.
So are we always 100% going to trade these 4 things that you are going to share with us?
Well, these 4 things, topicality style, bleed into different definitions, which essentially, Chris Wheatley asks, what does agriculture and food mean, all right?
Okay.
And then someone's going to push that definition as much as they can because they want to make money in Cuba. And then this question was asked, what does medical mean? Well, if medicine means sending over advanced nuclear medical technology, which there is nuclear medical technology that, then it's going to be tougher, all right? So the federal government still tends to need to approve it. Does that make sense? Let me finish the 4 exceptions. So the first is food. The second is medicine. The third is new, and it's telecommunications. Why would we pick telecommunications?
Because people want to have cell phones.
So we can spy on them. All right. So our conspiracy theorist in the audience. Edward Snowden is here. Okay. All right. Who knew? All right. The idea behind all of these exceptions is that, in the eyes of the United States federal government, we want to help the Cuban people without helping Castro. So the idea is that if Cubans have more access to the web or the ability to have conversations with a lot of people that are in the United States, that will bring about democratic ideas. Go ahead.
Didn't they try to do something like that in Florida? It backfired on them. Did they try to do called a rebellion and it backfired on them?
Well, how far back are we going? 60s? Yeah, we're going to talk about the Cuban Revolution in a bit. I promise I'll get to that. Yes. We have tried to overthrow Cuba subtly and very explicitly, and it's never worked, okay? But here, the idea, and we're trying to do this in other parts of the world, is that if they just get to kind of see YouTube, all right, they'll get exposed to all these new ideas. And some people think that the events in the Middle East are because more people are getting to see democracy. I think that that's an oversimplification. Is there a question here? Adam.
Wasn't there an instance of that in like the 1980s when people would when the U.S. sent over like telecommunications or something like that, and then they took prisoners because they thought they were spying on them or something like that? I thought there was it might not have been 80s, it might have been a little more recent. Because I remember reading an article about
the Alan Gross incident where the U.S. sent a State Department subcontractor to bring telecommunications primarily to the Jewish community in Cuba. And
I'm going to let Jail go on this. I know Alan Gross. It's more recent, am I right, Jail, than the...
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
He's been in jail for 2-3 years, I think. But he was arrested and convicted for, trying to subvert the Castro regime or the Cuban government through telecommunications without he had the permission of the State Department of the United States, but not the Cuban government to do some of the things he was doing and selling some of the items that he was selling.
Okay, your questions are great. Before I take the next wave, let me just finish the list of 4. Food, agriculture, telecommunications, and the travel ban has been eased, although not lifted, all right? Which means that Vera cannot just be like, I'm going to Havana, all right? She needs to apply and get an exception that the government accepts, okay? And this is for realties, okay? I'm not making this up. Jay-Z and Beyonce were like, we want to go to Cuba. Jay-Z and Beyonce, I mean, we're talking people that have a lot of influence and a lot of money. And the government was like, you have to go on an educational mission. So Jay-Z and Beyonce had to like walk around and interact with the Cuban people and make it part of an educational exchange, all right? Or else the government of the United States wasn't going to let this happen. So Vera's not going to be able to just go to Cuba and hang out on the beach. She's going to need to have to interact in an educational way with Cuban citizens, and she wants to. She told me yesterday, so that's I'm done with that. All right, many questions. Go ahead here.
What if any countries been faced with our secondary sanctions?
What? Okay, well, in theory, all the countries are faced with our secondary
Cuba's
sanctions.
been fined or like we stopped trading because of that.
Okay, so the biggest effect that secondary sanctions has is not when they get imposed, but the fear that they might. So I will draw upon the example of Cuban oil, where Spain, Norway, China, and other parts of Latin America, none of those are Latin America, but parts of Latin America, have all tried to drill in Cuba, but it's very hard to drill without having any American workers, any American parts, any American anything. And so they have had the cost of their drilling efforts in Cuba skyrocket because in trying to avoid sanctions, they have had to use parts that they've shipped in from other parts of the world. And Cuba, in particular, is geographically close to the United States, which would make it much more convenient to use U.S. parts. Okay? But we very rarely actually sanction another country, and it's lessened. We kind of bark at them first. Like we actually pretend to bark at Canada because the #1 country that sends the most tourists to Cuba is Canada, and we kind of don't want them to do it. And even Canada, and Canada would do anything we wanted, okay? All right? Even Canada is like, shut up, okay? You know what I mean? So, even Canada. All right? In fact, I'm going to say it differently. Canada. All right, there you go. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned Alan Gross.
Yes.
Didn't we do the same thing to find their citizens in Miami?
So, yeah, Alan Gross is a whole section of the topic. He's a particular guy. There'll be affirmative cases written about Alan Gross. He is an American that the United States would like to see released. Whenever the United States and Cuba talk, we do talk with Cuba. I don't want to make it sound like, you know, we're not Facebook friends, okay, but we're Facebook fans with them, you know what I mean? All right, so like we interact with them a little bit. When we do talk with Cuba, every time Alan Gross comes up, the United States says, please release them. And every time the Cubans say, there are 5 spies, we call them spies, that the United States has detained, we'll do a swap, and the United States is not down for the swap, okay? They're like, no, just give us Alan Gross. And that's, you know, that's how that goes. That's how that conversation goes. It's like a negotiation with your parents, you know, so. All right, we're good. We understand the 4 exceptions. All right. That was our longest bullet point on the embargo. So let's transition into more concise ones so that we can get some of the big things in on time. Bullet point number 2 is not the second most important thing, but it might be the most immediately important one for you, and that's the Cuba Oil Affirmative. The SDI has put together an affirmative about Cuban oil. It's in our starter pack. You have it on your jump drives, and I think it's very likely that you'll do some exercises about Cuban oil. So I'm going to explain the Cuban oil very briefly and field any questions that you have about it. If this island is Cuba, okay, how much oil has been successfully drilled in the waters that surround Cuba now? Who wants to guess? Kate.
A lot really shallow waters, but not really deep. There's a lot left.
Okay. Anyone else? That was just a stretch? Okay, go ahead. Okay. There's been a lot of drilling. We basically have not found jackpot in Cuba at all. Cuba is really not producing very much oil now. This creates a very difficult situation for Cuba where they have to import almost all of their energy. It would be great for Cuba if they could produce some of their own oil. As an aside, they import almost all of their energy from where? Venezuela gives it to them on a huge discount. Just because we haven't found the jackpot outside of Cuba doesn't mean that people haven't tried. There are 59 exploratory wells, which are spots where we think there might be oil, which have been investigated around Cuban waters, there may be as many as 90 good spots in Cuban territorial waters where one could get oil. If you talk to the Cuban experts, they'll say we have a ton of oil. If you talk to other experts, they're not so sure. The affirmative in this example would allow the United States to lift the embargo only for oil drilling and try to get the oil from Cuba. It has two advantages to this affirmative. One is that this would dramatically increase United States relations with Latin America. It's interesting some of the countries that the students chose. To be honest, Iceland doesn't care that much about the U.S. embargo because Iceland is just not a central player with Cuba. But Latin American countries really dislike the U.S. embargo. So if the United States were to soften its embargo, it would dramatically increase U.S.-Latin American relations. The more we lifted it, the happier Latin America would be. That could be good for a variety of reasons. Go ahead. The question is, would Latin America still be upset if the majority of the embargo was in place? So I have kind of two answers to that, okay? Putting on my affirmative hat, it's my affirmative hat. This is my Cuban hat. I kind of tried to dress Cuban today, okay? But then I realized I had no Cuban clothes because I'm not allowed to have any. All right, but this is the best I can do. All right, like I think like the shirts from Costa Rica. All right, that's the best I can do. All right. So putting on my affirmative hat, all right, I would say that if the United States softened its embargo for the first time in 50 years, people would be very happy with the Obama administration. It would be a very serious sign that warming of ties was beginning to happen. It's sort of like any bad relationship you're in your life, and then it starts to get better. It usually takes place in kind of small steps. And so I think the first step would be meaningful. Putting on my negative hat, I would say the parts of the embargo that Latin America would like to see lifted the most are not oil. They'd like to see the embargo be lifted in a way that helped the Cuban citizens to the largest degree. So you can have a debate about that when you debate that in your practice speeches this week. The second advantage to the affirmative is about oil spills. It's sort of weird to argue that it would be good to drill in Cuba because it would prevent oil spills. But actually, there is a warped logic where this might make some sense. Cuba, just like Katie in the example, if they can't get American Scooby Snacks, Cuba's going to get Scooby Snacks one way or another. And everyone agrees that Cuba does not really have the kind of technology and experience to drill successfully on their own. They don't have a very developed oil sector. So, as an alternative, Cuba would either attempt to do so on their own, unsuccessfully and dangerously, or use Spain or Russia or Norway or China or Uruguay, all of whom have expressed interest in drilling in Cuba, and arguably all of whom are not as experienced as the United States in terms of finding wells and keeping this safe. Now, of course, you could back it up and be like, well, the United States, you can think of a few spots where the United States has done a pretty unsuccessful job drilling oil, and you can debate that back and forth. But the truth of the matter is that the affirmative evidence is at least decent that the more the United States is involved, the less likely it is for an oil spill to take place, and that Cuba would jump at the chance to use U.S. companies because the current leadership in Cuba would very much like to be seen as having the United States caved to them. So if you're Castro, and we haven't talked enough about Castro, but if you're Castro, you actually want American Scooby Snacks, U.S. Scooby Snacks the most because it makes it look like you won the 50-year battle and they caved to you. So that's my big second bullet point, Cuban oil. You can ask me questions about it later. You want one quick question? Okay, later? All right. And your instructors will know a lot about Cuban oil. Let's talk about bullet point number 3, which is politics within Cuba. We talk about politics within the United States a lot. Let's talk about politics within Cuba. Who is in charge of Cuba? Okay, the correct answer is probably the Castro brothers. You have Fidel Castro, who is 86 years old. He has been in a leadership position in Cuba forever. Many American presidents, when they took office, have said, in my administration, we will see Fidel Castro go down. And Fidel Castro has outlasted 10 American presidents. All right? It's an interesting statistic. All right? So he's now 86 years old, and he has turned over leadership to his much younger brother, who's 82 years old. Okay? His younger brother is Raul Castro. And the two of them have been part of the history of fighting the United States embargo for 50 years. Very recently, this spring, Raul Castro said, I am going to retire in 2018, which as an aside, I mean, he's no spring chicken, all right, so he's pretty confident he's going to make it to 2018. And when I retire in 2018, I would like to turn the reins over to a guy whose last name is Diaz. D-I-A-Z. And Diaz, who's currently 59 years old, is also part of the current Castro regime. But I think that there are meaningful differences between all three of these guys, and I want to discuss them. If you're Fidel Castro and you fought the United States, and we're going to talk about the wars that were referenced over here, I mean, you are the most extreme of the three. So the 86-year-old Fidel Castro, he was not a fan of doing anything that was too supportive to the United States. And one thing that hasn't been explained enough is that Cuba, unlike the United States, is for the most part not a capitalist country. Which means that if you interact with oil in the United States, you interact with Exxon, you interact with Mobil. If you interact with oil in Cuba, you're interacting with a company that's owned by the government. So one of the reasons that the United States does not want to send any Scooby snacks to Cuba is because when Cuban businesses make money, Castro makes money. Because all the businesses in Cuba are run by the government. It would be as though the boss of the Spartan Debate Institute was Barack Obama, and that any money that we made off of the Spartan Debate Institute would go to Barack Obama. All right? That's not how things are. The United States believes in free enterprise, where if you make money, you can keep that money, and that gives you an incentive to improve your products. Here in Cuba, almost all entities are run by the government, or at least the profits are sent to the government. Fidel Castro, I'm going to go from Fidel to Raul to Diaz, all right? Fidel was the most in favor of having things be run by the government. But Raul, his much younger brother, okay, has started to initiate some market reforms. And I've thrown around the word market too much. Some business-oriented reforms. Raul's a little bit more willing to let businesses keep their money, whereas Fidel wasn't. Make sense now? Yeah. Okay? Yeah.
In the Cuban Revolution, wasn't Raul originally the radical one who Fidel had to pretend, had to distance himself from when he was asked?
They were all radical. There's, all right, but yes, this is a change, if that's what you're asking. But 50 years causes people to change. Okay? Yeah.
Do we know what Diaz's view on it is?
And this is where I'm going with this. All right? Fidel, most pro-government, least pro-business. Raul starting to show himself to be a little bit more pro-business. People think that Diaz will be even more so. We don't know a lot about Diaz, to be honest. All right? Go ahead.
When the Cuban government start letting businesses keep a good chunk of their money, that it started to take away business
It's a very controversial thing. I don't think everyone was able to hear her question. Her question was, isn't it true that when Cuban businesses made more money, the government made less money in Cuba? Definitionally, that's true, okay? So, you can't move too fast if you're Raul, and you especially can't move too fast if you're Diaz, all right? Because the quicker you start to take money towards businesses in Cuba, the sooner you're taking money away from a bunch of people that currently work in government who are not going to like it. So it's not going to be a walk in the park for Cuba to just become a capitalist, non-government oriented business tomorrow, okay? Too many people are too invested in the way that things currently are, okay? Go ahead. Loud.
Isn't Diaz the vice president right now?
Diaz was a member of like the equivalent of their cabinet and has been handpicked to be the vice president. So, people think in 2018 Diaz will take over. But that's not a given, because especially if the Castros aren't alive anymore, other people are going to want a piece of that pie. People are just going to be like, we're not just going to let Diaz just run the show, okay? So there's a big question mark as to what 2018 will look like. The United States would like Diaz to be as much like the United States as possible, all right? Good luck, okay? And if Diaz is too much like the United States, he might get in trouble, and someone else might assume a leadership position in Cuba. Do you have a follow-up question? It seems like.
Do you think there's a chance that Castro is going to hand it over to Diaz before 2018, or like before if he's like in bad health? Do you think he might?
Yes, I think that's a chance. I think the reason that they announced kind of that he was the next what's called successor is because there was a chance that 5 years from today, an 87-year-old Raul Castro may, like his older brother before him, not be in a position where he wanted to run the day-to-day affairs in Cuba. Was there a question here? Go ahead.
Do you think relations with Cuba would change after the Castro brothers die?
Okay, say that really loud.
Would relations with Cuba change after the Castro brothers die?
Would relations with Cuba change if the Castro brothers died? Yes. Okay? Let's talk about the act from 1996 that I kept screwing up the date on, and I apologize. That act, I am not making this up. This is unbelievable. In that act, the Libertad Act and whatever the other long title is, explicitly says that this act is in effect so long as the Castro brothers are in charge of Cuba. It's like built into the law, okay? Now, the honest answer to your question is, if both Castro brothers died tomorrow, it would depend what Cuba decided to do. Because the fundamental position of the United States is not, we hate the Castros, although I think that they're a very big symbol. I think instead the fundamental position of the United States is, are you going to have free markets, pro-businesses, etc., or are you not? Are you going to treat the Cuban people well, or are you not? And if the new leadership is more in line with what the United States would like, then the United States-Cuban relations will go up. If not, they'll stay the same. Go ahead.
Is Cuba just like being stubborn? Like if we were to lift the embargo, would Cuba be like, we won, now we'll do everything you wanted us to do? Not everything, but like to an extent less than what they're doing.
Well, okay, that's a very complicated question, okay? And I don't want to speak for the Cubans as to whether or not they're being stubborn, okay? But the truth of the matter is, not everything would change overnight, but if we lifted the embargo, it would dramatically improve U.S.-Cuban relations, because that's a huge, huge irritant in U.S.-Cuban relations. Okay, we're doing great. A lot of good questions. Go.
Who would the Cuban government blame if the U.S. lifted the embargo?
They would applaud themselves. They wouldn't blame anyone.
Okay, but then when the people get angry...
Why would they be angry if the embargo was lifted?
Because they would be upset with their government.
Oh, so if the government continued to make a bunch of money off of that?
Right.
So there are a lot of people that argue the U.S. should lift the embargo so as to put pressure on the Cuban government, because there'd be all this money flowing to and from Cuba, and Cuban people wouldn't get enough of a slice of that pie. And a lot of people also argue what I think you're getting at, which is that the United States couldn't be the person to blame anymore. All right, so that's a classic affirmative argument. The negative argument is that the Castros would swallow all the money and that Cubans couldn't really start a revolution because the Castros are too powerful. Go ahead.
If Raul kicked the can, but Fidel was still around.
Raul kicked the can, okay.
Would he regain leadership?
If Raul died before Fidel?
Yeah, would Fidel be
If that were to happen, Fidel would want someone in charge that was more like him. Whether or not he would convince Diaz to do that, or if he would do it himself, I don't think he would do it himself. I think he thinks he can't do day-to-day government. Miles.
Remember when you were talking about earlier how other Latin American countries get upset at us because of the embargo?
They do.
How serious do you think that could get?
How serious do I think that could get? I think it's gotten about as serious as it's going to get because we've had it for 50 years, to be honest. I think instead, there are unrelated things that Latin American countries are angry about. The single thing that the Latin American countries dislike the most is that U.S. presidents don't pay a lot of attention to Latin America. In fact, in the first term, the Obama administration personally visited Latin America 0 times. The administration made 2 trips with non-Obama officials to the region. So they feel blown up. This might be a sign that we're paying more attention to Latin America's interests. Go ahead.
In 2018,
Yes.
Diaz becomes the leader of Cuba.
Yeah.
And the Castros are still alive. Are they still the same in government?
The Castros will have say in the Cuban government as long as they're alive, even if they're not running day-to-day affairs. Yeah. Go ahead.
Other than the U.S. and Cuba, who do you think will benefit most from the embargo being lifted if it were?
Who would benefit the most if the embargo was lifted besides the United States and Cuba? Well, I'd actually put one entity ahead of the United States and Cuba, and that would be businesses. Okay? Cuban businesses would make a lot more money if they could trade with the United States. Every country that was ever afraid about secondary sanctions would like that move, and I think Latin American countries would care a lot more than Iceland. All right. One more. Read, and we got to keep moving.
What's the guarantee that even if we lift the embargoes pertains to oil, that Cuba's state oil companies will actually want to engage U.S. firms?
Cuba wants, his question is, why would they want us? Okay, and the answer is, as long as the rest of the embargo is in place, Cuba would love it, and the evidence for the affirmative is great on this, to take U.S. firms, because it would be a propaganda move for them to be like, we got the United States to come and do our bidding because we won the war over the embargo. I actually think the negative argument that Cuba wouldn't accept the United States is a weak argument, because I think that Cuba has a big incentive to accept the United States to prove that they won this 50-year-long feud. Bullet points number 4, politics within the United States. Politics within the United States. On most issues in this country, the Democrats have one stance, the Republicans have another stance. It's pretty easy to identify. Transportation infrastructure. All right? Republicans don't like spending. Democrats are more in favor of spending. This topic is different, and Cuba is different still. Okay? So let's talk about how the politics of Cuba in the United States is very different than you might think. First of all, under this section, the politics of Cuba is overwhelmingly determined by the state of Florida. The politics of Cuba in the United States is overwhelmingly determined by the state of Florida. Florida is a state that sometimes is won by the Democrats in presidential elections, and it's sometimes won by the Republicans in presidential elections. Before your time, this will make all the adults in the room feel really old. Before your time, in the year 2000, there was a presidential election, every 4 years in fact, and the presidential election came down to just the state of Florida, and it was so close between the Democrats and Republicans that it hinged on just a few votes, and you know the rest, okay? So, people in the state of Florida have the most extreme opinions about Cuba because the majority of Cuban exiles are living now in the state of Florida. Depending on how you define territorial waters, Cuba is 90 to 70 miles away from the United States. That's really close. And a lot of Cuban exiles lived under Castro, got to the United States, some in awful situations where they had to take a boat or a raft, and a lot of the Cuban exiles, which now live in Florida, hate Castro. And if you're a Democrat or a Republican and you're from South Florida, it's very difficult to be supportive of Cuba because there's huge Cuban populations. Many of these people are very passionate about this issue, and you would take a real hit if you were a Florida politician, Democrat or Republican, and you were too supportive of Castro. And Florida matters to elections more than a lot of other states because it's a huge state, because it's a swing state that could go for the Democrats or Republicans, etc. To prove that I'm not making this all up, there are 3 members of the Congress that you'll talk about the most this year on Cuba policy. One is a Republican named Marco Rubio, who was strongly considered for a while as a potential vice presidential candidate. He is a Republican from Florida. He's in the Senate, and he is super opposed to being nice to Cuba. He would not like it if we gave Scooby snacks to Cuba. He's not messing around. And it doesn't even matter what he really thinks, because he would take all kinds of heat from the people that he represents if he were too nice to Cuba. Secondly, is a woman in Congress named Ileana Ross. She has a hyphenated last name, Ross Lehtinen. I looked up the pronunciation because it's hard to pronounce. You can look it up. The particulars aren't important. All right. She is a member of the House of Representatives. She's a fascinating background. She was born in Havana. She's of Jewish descent. She emigrated to the United States. And she is vocally anti-Cuba.
Is she a Republican or a Democrat?
She's a Republican. Good question. Both she and Marco Rubio, I'm starting with the Republicans, aren't just people in the Congress. They sit on incredibly important committees inside the United States Congress. They can exert extreme influence. She sits on the Foreign Relations Committee, which is a very powerful entity. She used to chair the Foreign Relations Committee, and she chaired it for so long that they had someone else chair it. She still sits on it. She's very, very powerful. She is vocally anti-Cuba. However, Democrat Bob Menendez from New Jersey, who's also a very powerful senator, he is also vocally anti-Cuba.
What's his name again?
Bob Robert Menendez.
He's from New York.
New Jersey. Or more generally, let me wrap up American politics. There's very little support inside the United States government for softening or being nicer to Cuba. Very little support. The Republicans think that Fidel Castro does not support capitalism, does not support free markets, and has abused Cuban people with human rights violations for a long time. The Democrats don't like that Castro commits human rights violations. And all the Republicans and the Democrats would face big electoral pressure if they were seen as too nice to Cuba, particularly from prominent exiled communities that live in Florida. I'll get your question in 1 second. So there's more political points to be won by being mean to Cuba than there are in being nice to Cuba. But I want to talk about a very significant difference, because someone could criticize me for being incomplete. Which of the 3 people in Cuba is the most hardcore? Who's the oldest? Who's the second most hardcore? Who's the second oldest? Who's the least hardcore? Who's the youngest? That same phenomenon exists in the United States. The older you are, the more you remember the events of history that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And the more attached you are, if you're Fidel Castro, to the fights you had with the United States. As people get further and further removed from that, the less intense they are. And so in the last presidential election, for the first time, we saw Cubans that live in Florida supporting positions that were a little bit more friendly to Cuba, because generationally, the older you are, the closer you are to the really hot, nasty battles that existed between the United States and Cuba. And as we get further removed from that, younger generations of Cubans in Cuba, younger generations of United States citizens in the United States are starting to be more in favor of relationships. People are not as angry as they once were about the U.S.-Cuban relationship, but some of the people with the most money and the most power are also the oldest. And they are running the show now. That might not be true in 2018. Go ahead.
Isn't Mario Diaz-Balart, the guy from Florida, Castro's nephew?
Is Diaz Castro's nephew?
Yeah.
I should know that. I don't know the answer to that. Someone can check me. Do you mean Rubio?
Mario Diaz-Balart, the congressman in Florida.
Oh, a different Diaz. Is someone related to Castro? I don't want to comment on that because I don't know, but I confess my ignorance. So that's like, seems like a Wikipedia check. All right. Other questions? Okay. Bullet point number 5 is history. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not.
His aunt was the first wife of Fidel Castro.
Okay. Sounds like a complicated paternity question. Might be on the TLC network. Yeah. All right. I'll just say this. I don't think that is like a central thing for like a politics issue. All right. History. Let's get back to the question that was asked over here. Didn't we get into a fight with Cuba? Well, kind of. Yeah. So in 1950, we were totally buddy-buddy with Cuba. There was a guy named Batista, Batista, who was a total ally of the United States. From 1953 to 1959, there was a revolution in Cuba. Fidel Castro played a very central role. Think about do the math, all right? He's 86 years old now, 1953, okay? All right? And Batista gets booted. The friend of the U.S. is out. Castro is running the show. But Castro doesn't just start to run the show. Castro starts being friends with the Soviet Union, the people that the United States at that time couldn't stand the most. They start trading, they start talking, and President Eisenhower says, I don't like this one bit. So, President Eisenhower starts to plan some sort of CIA-sponsored effort to try to get Castro out of power. And in 1960, he hands off the plan to the new president, John F. Kennedy. They plan it for a little while, and in 1961, in April of 1961, the United States attempts over 3 days to overthrow the Castro regime because they're getting too cozy with the Soviet Union in an episode that's called The Bay of Pigs, which you've maybe heard about. And I don't mention this. I think that some of the deep history sometimes gets lost on the younger students, but if you were to read an article about Cuba, it would reference the Bay of Pigs. Like, this is a big deal, okay? It was a U.S.-sponsored effort to try to overthrow Cuba. So maybe you can understand why Fidel Castro was like, I don't like the United States. Because there he was in the center of an attempt to be ousted. The Bay of Pigs fails. Not very many people die, but the United States does not successfully overthrow the Cuban forces. But the Soviet Union, I got to get my map correct because what was over here, the United States, blah, blah, blah. So the Soviet Union, okay, they noticed this episode and they're like, whoa, the United States is going to keep trying stuff like this. And we want to have a good relationship with Cuba, which is 70 to 90 miles away from the United States. Wouldn't it be awesome if we had a great relationship with them, if we could put some of our missiles and soldiers, etc. there? And so, in 1962, the Soviet Union and Castro decide, hey, we're going to try to send some weapons, potentially nuclear weapons, to Cuba. The United States is like, no dice, okay? We are not having nuclear weapons 70 to 90 miles away from our border. And this creates the Cuba Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The U.S. does everything it can to stop this from taking place. As an aside, Cuba has already started to build up some weapons of its own with some help from the Soviet Union, although not nuclear weapons. And the United States does institute a naval blockade. So, like when we're talking over here, would the United States implement a naval blockade for Scooby Snacks? No. Okay. Would they for a nuclear weapon? Yes. They did. Okay. And eventually the situation is resolved, although most experts believe that the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was the closest that we ever came to a nuclear war. That there were credible threats, that the United States had false alarms, that the United States experienced tensions were very high between the Soviet Union and the United States over this island called Cuba. Cuba does not get nuclear weapons. It's not to say that the blockade was perfectly successful. There were negotiations that also took place. Cuba, in fact, and the Soviet Union agree that whatever they started to build up will be sent back to the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis resolves without any nuclear weapons, any nuclear war, anything like that. But those two episodes are cited a lot in the history of Cuba. And the people that are running the United States and running Cuba that remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, they're pretty conservative about being nice to the other guy. The sixth and final thing that I want to talk about, I promised Carly I'd be done in 3 minutes from now, is Guantanamo Bay. I assured you at the beginning I couldn't do justice to all things Cuba because it's hard. All right? I can already think of things I wished I'd talk. I didn't even talk about Cuban cigars. All right? What is Guantanamo Bay? Go ahead, Reed. I'll do the short version. It's a U.S. naval base. It's in southeast Cuba. To be honest, I don't understand why we have it. Technically, the land belongs to Cuba. Technically, we lease the land from Cuba, but we say things like, we run the whole show, basically. Every year we send Cuba a check for rent. We send them a check for $4,085. They've never cashed the check. One year in 1974, they accidentally cashed the check and then said that they didn't mean to. So they protest the idea of the arrangement, but the United States is not going anywhere. It's a big base. All right? And it is most famous in the current era, not just for being a naval base, but being home to where the United States takes suspects that were gathered in the wars with Iraq, Afghanistan, or who are otherwise believed to be involved in terror operations. There's something about it that because it's not totally on U.S. soil, but it's still run by the United States, where that's a place that the United States decides to engage in, at least under the Bush administration, more aggressive interrogation procedures, which some people think mean torture. I think there's a lot of international criticism about the existence of Guantanamo Bay. Affirmatives will on this topic, and this is why I mention this, argue that it's an act of economic engagement to end our lease with Cuba. Leases are economic, and to get out of there. Leases are economic. Affirmatives will argue that the United States federal government should end its leasing arrangement with Cuba, return Guantanamo Bay to Cuba, end our practices of militaries being involved there, and maybe make a difference as it relates to our image of torture, etc. I know I only wanted to get through 6 points. I like never get through all my points. By the way, every lecture that's ever been given, people like say 10 points or 5 points. I said 6 because that's what you needed to know. All right, so there it is. All right. Thank you very much for your time. If you have individual questions, come forth and ask them. We have a 10-minute break. Carly's going to talk about Venezuela at 10:30. So I'm here and I'll answer questions all the way through. Thank you.